considerably more complicated. I don't know that the effort that goes into those calculations or to those complications is going to yield a fair amount of insight. For example, instead of having, when we were talking about how the discount rate changed the incentive to cheat, we don't have to use 2 periods. We could use 3. So you don't cheat now, cheat in the second, and then suffer in the third. But the idea is already established, and there's a time dimension to the question in that how do I compare developments in the future to the developments in the present is through the discount rate. Therefore, the discount rate is now relevant. I don't particularly like very much fiscal policy. And to that extent, your education here is going to suffer from it. Not too much, but it's going to be a little gap. Let me go over, you will see in a minute why is it that my hesitation about fiscal policy. This is not, what bothers me is not so much the fiscal, what bothers me is the word policy. Fiscal affairs matter. That to me falls under the heading of public finance. So let's go. So you can see that I didn't even write notes for this. I just don't like it not at all, right? And so I'm trying to put as little effort into this. I inject a couple of notes in here and there, but not much, right? So what is the big deal about this? Fiscal affairs translate into sovereign debt or into government debt. And government debt has a way of affecting the economy, therefore fiscal affairs affect the economy. Now that assumes that we know how to measure the subject of interest. That means that we know how to measure the budget deficit. We don't. And we're gonna talk a little about that. And if that wasn't enough, there are some guys who believe, and perhaps I'm in that camp, that fiscal policies do not matter because any fiscal policy is offset by a reaction of the private sector. That's what became known as recurrent abuse. It's a counterpart to rational expectations. So the guys in monetary say if you have rational expectations, there is absolutely no role for monetary policy. Zero. And so much of what we have done in here is demonstrating that viewpoint. That anytime that you have rational expectations, monetary policy is effective only in the short run. It cannot affect out in the long run. The counterpart in fiscal affairs is recurrent equivalence. So it's not so much about expectations, but it relies on an understanding of how fiscal affairs evolve over time. And then we're going to go a little on that, and then we're going to give you other perspective on that. At the end, I don't like fiscal affairs, but I like you, and so I was not going to just shortchange you on this crap. I'm going to leave this out. I'm going to leave it out because it's dated. The book was published in 2014, and it doesn't tell me what is the date for this. I know it's dated because the debt to GDP ratio of the United States is more than 74%. I know that. So this is dated. So you can see, beginning to see why exactly is that I don't like this all that much. This is where I get off. Okay? Now let's take a peek to I want to talk about this partly because this really bothers me. Matthew's trying to make the point that fiscal affairs matter. All right, that's fine. Let's take a look to the developments that are highlighted in here. Revolutionary War, Civil War, World War I, World War II, financial crisis. And so it is, by their own admission, wars is what drives fiscal policy. I don't know, the big bumps in here are not driven by, oh, we have to bring the unemployment rate down to the natural rate. Forget that. That's not how fiscal policy works. Fiscal policy works because our American way of life is going to change, and we're sure I'm not going to do it. and so we're just gonna spend whatever we don't have, and here it is. We didn't like the Brits, we didn't like each other, Europe got into their own problems, we got into our own problems, and here's the financial crisis. This is, of all these developments, this is the only one that I can see that is associated with economic affairs. Monetary policy is not doing this. Monetary policy is looking at inflation and unemployment. What is the objective of fiscal policy? Beats me. Because in the United States, fiscal policy is made up by, let's just call it 500 individuals. And it's an interaction between the executive and the legislative branch of the United States. Do they get along? No, they don't. How do I know? They closed down the government last year. You could not go to the Lincoln Memorial. You could not go to the Jefferson Memorial. You could not go to the Smithsonian. You could not go to any of these things. We shut the government down. Yeah. And so, what is this? We're gonna now talk about fiscal policy? That sounds like crap to me. There are other little things in here that I want you to, that I'm sensitive, and maybe you're sensitive. When you talk about, when I see ratio of US government and debt to GDP, there are two things in here that are not correct. First one, the understanding of the United States in 1791, that is, what made up those countries, is not the same as in here. Here were there just 13 colonies, most of them in the east of the United States. The United States, Hawaii joined the Union in the middle of the 20th century. You know, so we're not talking about, to me, we're not talking about a very same United States. We're talking about something that is very different over time. The second thing that got me pissed is that, and I hope you get pissed the moment I say it, is that the national income accounts were developed in the late 40s. The notion of GDP became introduced into economic discussions in the late 40s, after the war. In other words, we don't know what the GDP here is. It's not that we couldn't construct it. It's rather it is that they didn't know what GDP is. When the Federal Reserve, they didn't know what GDP was in the Great Depression. So the idea that they looked at the data and said, man, GDP is tanking, that was not part of it. And so I want now for you to be a little annoyed at the ease with which Mankiw shows this graph and ask us to, oh right, fiscal policy is really important. No, it isn't. Now, the next thing that fiscal policy work is involved is it's not so much about, it's always about looking into the future, way into the future. Right? And so one of the things that they do is they look at the fraction of the population that it is going to be old. So I'm already there. Right? So this is what you're looking at, what old is. Me, Ariel, me, you're looking at me. I'm in this group. Okay? And so that's what they do. And why would they do that? Well, because two things. Fiscal affairs are driven by tax collection. Tax collection are driven by individuals working. And so guys in this age group don't work, right? And so to the extent that that proportion increases, and to that extent, tax collection is going to be taking a hit. The second thing that matters is that individuals in this age in the United States are beneficiaries of what's called an entitlement program. Medicare, Medicaid, is Social Security. And so the expenditures on the part of the government are increasing, tax collection is decreasing, and so this is really important for fiscal affairs. The problem that people, or that I have, is Okay, so is this taking into account immigration? I, no. Well, doesn't that matter for the United States? Yeah. Oh, all right, well then let's see the next. And so here they show you the evolution of, this is the expenditure side of the US government, spending Medicare. And this is, you were seeing here, this is what became known as the Great Society, where the US federal government was effectively providing as much assistance to individuals as possible. Here begins the Reagan administration, which sought and got the virtual elimination of those, or at least stopping those benefits, and then moved along. Here's another episode of things that I don't particularly like. Right? And it's to me, it's you know, it's just, that's what I was talking about before. Let's get to imaginary creatures and then ask about their differences in their habits. So let's bring the unicorn and Pegasus, and let's see who runs, or which of these two runs faster. So here is, we imagine a world, a world in which the tax cuts of the Bush administration are extended, and that's what happens. And the other world is where those tax cuts do not get extended. This leaves me cold. Right? This is, how would my life be different if I had been raised and grown up in Italy? Oh, it would have been the red line. How would it be if I had been raised, say, Canada? Well, it would have been the green line. So, you know, what do I do with that crap? Not much. And so, but this is the typical introduction to fiscal policies, where they tell you that the world is coming to an end, that you have to pay attention to this. I don't buy into that. Okay, so now we get into a little more substantive issues. The first question that is going to arise is, how do we measure the deficit? That sounds like a simple thing, like revenue minus expenditures, what's the conversation about? We will do that one thing. And so there are going to be 4 items in here that get in the way of nailing the deficit. The first one is inflation. Then there's going to be the issue of how do we actually compute the deficit. Then there's going to be uncounted liabilities and the business cycle. All of these are real problems. I mean, they're genuine, both from the standpoint of understanding the functioning of the economy, and from the standpoint, say from an academic standpoint. Why do you do that? Okay, so here we go. The first thing that is done to capture the role of inflation is to assume that the real debt is constant. Okay? It doesn't have to be constant, but that's what this example is. What we're trying to do is to highlight a potential role for inflation. So if the real debt is constant, then so is the real deficit. Because if the real deficit was not, the real deficit is not 0, then the real debt cannot be constant. CBP. If these two things are true, then the debt has to be growing at a rate equal to the inflation rate. And so here you have the growth rate of the debt in nominal terms equals the inflation rate, or alternatively to say the change in the debt is the inflation rate times the debt. What is reported in the government accounts as a deficit is this I times D, even though the real deficit is 0. And so what he's saying is that we need to take into account inflation. And so what we're going to do is to subtract this term, how much of the deficit is owed to the increase in the inflation rate, from the reported deficit to correct for inflation. And so far, I'm going along, yeah, I can see that, okay. Then then we got into my problems. Example, in 1979, the nominal deficit was $28 billion. Inflation was 8.6, the debt was 495, and so here it is what he says. So what is the real deficit? This is what gets reported at $28 billion, but that to him is just not meaningful, because that is reflecting not just fiscal purchases and fiscal revenues, but also the role of inflation. And so what you need to do is to subtract the role of inflation, and lo and behold, he goes from a deficit to a surplus in one simple calculation. Okay? I mean, that takes work to be this creative. You can imagine that you can be, well, it's not 28, it's 2. Right? You can imagine, but to turn it around. All right. So what follows is my little nitpicks. And so he's assuming that the real debt is constant, and I said, well, I want to know what that means. So the RD, the real debt at time t, is the same as at time t minus 1 is constant, okay? And then I said, well, how do I go from this expression to the one he has? Well, this is the expression for the growth rate of nominal debt. The numerator is the change in nominal debt. The change in nominal debt is the real times the price of labor. Price of labor times t minus 1, and so you can carry out that calculation and you wind up at the inflation rate. And so he's claiming that the real deficit is the change in nominal debt minus the inflation correction. And so I put this in here because I wanted to make sure that I was understanding what he was doing. And so, okay, we're done. Now, my problems. He's trying to get a measure of the real deficit. And I'm saying, well, why couldn't you divide the nominal deficit by the price level? The way we measure real GDP, you take nominal GDP, you divide that by the price level, and we call that real. Why couldn't I do the same thing for the deficit? Tell me what the deficit is, $28 billion. Tell me what the price level is. I deflate it. I just divide by the price level. And so I will then be reducing the magnitude. What unsettles me is that he didn't just reduce the magnitude, he changed the sign of it. Okay? Okay. So that question I don't think he's particularly interested in answering. But I was curious about it. Then I said, all right, his calculations assume that the real debt is constant, but what if it isn't? And so here's the real debt at time t minus 1. This is the real debt at the time of Adam and Eve is called all, or in his calculations, 1791. And then the accumulated values of the deficits over time, where I'm deflating them by the price level. All right. So to have consistency with Mankiw's calculation, I'm going to need this entire thing to be equal to 0. In other words, that's the only way I'm going to get the real debt change. But then that sounds to me like that I'm going to have either each little delta being 0 or a pattern of deficits such that that entire thing is 0. And I'm saying, what do I gain by making that assumption? The answer is nothing. At least to my way of looking at the world. In other words, I can make an assumption about the real debt being constant and not look at what that implies for the cumulative deficits. I can do that. That's not a big deal. But the question is the implication for the cumulative deficits reasonable? Or am I imposing a pattern for which there is no logic? Or at least logic that I can detect. And that's what I see here. So first, I am not all that gung-ho on this subtracting inflation times the debt from the deficit and calling that real. If you are, however, then we probably should get together and see how is it that you can answer this question, because I just don't see you can. I don't see how you can live with that assumption. Okay. This one is particularly complicated. It goes like this. The deficit is currently measured as the change in debt. The change in debt is, or the deficit is, expenditures minus revenue, and that gap translates into borrowing, and that borrowing is then added to the existing debt. Fine. He has a slightly different way of looking at it. He's saying, why don't we measure this as the change in debt minus the change in assets? Right? You say, I don't have anything against that. And so, for example, the example that he has, suppose a government sells an office building and he uses the proceeds to pay down the debt. So in that case, under the conventional definition, there's a decline in the deficit. Under this alternative, there is no change, because it is true that our debt went down, but so did our assets. Now, this is particularly relevant for countries that have a fair amount of government intervention, or governments that have, I think in China they're called state-owned enterprises. And then when the government decides to sell those enterprises, the government is selling assets that are not being captured in the measure of the deficit. And he's saying, that doesn't sound right to me. And I have to agree with that. There's something to this. Uncounted liabilities. Uncounted liabilities is, I don't know how to deal with this, but this is the tension. In the United States and other countries, the government has what's called a safety net. That safety net entails that when you work, you pay something, you make a contribution to something called, in the United States, Social Security. And that constitutes a promise for you to receive Social Security payments when you retire. Okay? And so in the United States, when you're working and you pay taxes, those go directly into the calculation of the budget deficit. But the promise of the government to pay you in the future does not. So that's it. When you're working and you're contributing to Social Security, that is a liability that the government has to you in the future. And he's saying that liability ought to be part of the show. And I agree with that. The business cycle. When we have a budget deficit, we have a calculation of economic activity times tax rates minus government purchase and expenditures. A regular budget deficit will use whatever economic activity is in place. And so what happens most of the time is that during the business cycle, where there's a decline in economic activity, that creates a shortfall in tax collection, and it creates an increase in insurance or unemployment compensation. And therefore, every time that there's a downturn in the business cycle, there's an increase in the deficit. What some people want to know is whether the deficit that we see would have been present even if we could have full employment. And so we're now back to full employment. And so here is what he has. The red line is the actual deficit of the United States relative to GDP. And the blue line is what's called cyclically adjusted budget deficit. So for computing the taxes, the blue line is not using GDP, it's using potential GDP. And if you go, let me see, make sure. I'm just looking for, if you go to the Congressional Budget Office and you try to bring the historical data on potential output, you're going to get vintages of potential output, 1991 to the present. So So what we mean by potential output is up for grabs. Therefore, what we mean by this deficit, the cyclically adjusted deficit, is up for grabs. We don't know. And that's what, this is the one thing that that I want you to, if there's one lesson in all this, this is the one that I want you to get out. That do not take measures of the budget deficit as conveyors of the ultimate truth in the current situation. All right. What I want to do now is to talk about the extent to which the debt is really a problem. Here is one view is what we call the traditional view, and the other one is the recurrent view. The traditional view says that if you were to undertake a tax cut, what that would do in the short run would expand economic activity and will lower the unemployment rate. This is the fiction that the guys that talk about policymaking have in mind. This is their belief. This belief was probably initiated during the Great Depression in Keynes, where monetary policy was just decorative and fiscal policy was the only thing that they had. And so this is a left, from my way of looking at the world, this is a hangover from that period. You saw the chart from Mankiw showing all the movements in the budget deficit and in the debt. It's not economic activity these guys are carrying, it's wars. In the long run, fiscal policy, just like monetary policy, cannot change the level of output, it cannot change the level of the unemployment rate in the long run. So these guys are gonna go back to the natural rate. And now we get two flavors depending upon whether the economy is closed or open. If the economy is closed, an expansionary fiscal policy will raise the interest rate and lower the opening. And if the economy is open, then it will appreciate the exchange rate and induce a very decline in the net export. All right. This is the ISLM in action. This is the conventional view. He says that's just a view, that's not the truth. Here's this guy called David Ricardo, who in addition to having this called Ricardo equivalence, is the guy who invented the notion of comparative advantage. You will be acquainted with this in the fall. Economics has about 4 or 5 genuine gems. Comparative advantage, opportunity cost, overshooting. Well, there is just 3. Something that it is unique to economics, something that you cannot just import it from another field and call it economics. Maybe perfect competition, but okay. The recurring guys say that fiscal policy is completely ineffective. Their cousins are the monetarists that believe that expectations are rational. So therefore, there is no point in monetary authorities changing the money supply because we all know how the economy functions to form our expectations, and therefore, monetary policy is not going to have an effect. They're going to have a comparable channeling here, even in the short run. So this is considerably more stringent than the guys in monetary policy. All right, so how does that work? What I want you to imagine is that there's a tax cut today. Normally, this will lead to an increase in disposable income, and by the way we reason, this increase in disposable income will lead to an increase in consumption and an increase in economic activity. Not so, said the Ricardo guys, because an increase, a reduction in taxes to finance generates a deficit, and here comes their view, it has to be paid. It has to be ultimately paid. And how is the government going to pay for in the future for the deficit that it created today? By raising taxes. You know this, therefore you're not going to, what you do is to say, my taxes go down now, but they're going to go up in the future because the government will be solvent ultimately. And so whatever they're giving away now, they're going to ask for it back in the future. So I increase my savings today. Okay? So the decline in taxes does not generate any counterpart increase in consumption. It just generates an increase in savings. Therefore, it does not affect the economy even in the short run. Okay? Does that make any sense to you? Well, not for everybody. The idea here is that, some people said, say that you are 65 and there's this big tax cut, and you know that the government in 20 years is going to have to raise taxes. They said, I'm not going to pay it. And so, why would I give a damn about that? So, I don't. Now, he calls it myopia, I call it old age, right? It's not myopia, I can see it, I just don't care. This is like seeing some developments in Jupiter, some gas explosions in Jupiter. You can see it, I just don't care. Borrowing constraint, I kind of like this. I like this because most of the work that we do ignores the role of finance. Most of the role it just abstracts that in order for me to have housing services, I need to borrow. And I'm not gonna be able to save for long enough so that I can buy the house by the time I go, say, 70. So I borrow now, but that's another way of saying that borrowing constraints matter. And so what this means is that to the extent that I cannot borrow all I want, if you increase my disposable income, I'm gonna use it because I'm not gonna be able to borrow to get the consumption that I want. So I use every little bit. Future generations, this is what I was talking a moment ago. If you're 65 or older, it's just, I don't know how else to put it. If you're 65 or older, then you're not as concerned about what's going to happen 50 years from now, especially for a regular consumer. Which brings me to the issue of the discount rate, which brings me to the issue of cheating monetary policy. Okay? This is another episode where the intertemporal considerations matter. This is another way of saying that for older individuals, the discount rate is so high, the future is not, for all intents and purposes, does not exist. And what matters is the now. All right. Is there any evidence against this Ricardian equivalence? Yes, there is. Every time that there has been anything that looks like a fiscal policy, early 80s, 1992. The response of consumption has contradicted the predictions of Ricardian equivalence. Notice how different fiscal policy is, right? Early 80s, 92. What happened in between? Well, nothing, right? And so, this is the sort of thing why I don't like fiscal policy all that much. Not that it doesn't matter, it's that I don't like it. And therefore, you're suffering as a result of that. The guys in my line of work have this tendency to rationalize. And so they bring this recurring equivalent. They see the data. The data does not support the recurring equivalent. How can we reconcile the viewpoints? Well, here's the saying, well, consumers may have expected the debt to be repaid with future spending cuts instead of future tax hikes. Well, but then the Ricardian equivalence is crap. And if you're now going to start saying that a tax cut today can be met in the future by either a tax increase or a decline in purchases, well then, something is going to happen. Private savings may have fallen for reasons other than the tax cut, such as optimism about the economy. Jesus. So this is why I don't like fiscal policy. It's an invitation to talk and talk and talk and then talk some more. Okay. In the United States, around 84 or 85, Congress came up with a brilliant idea of having an amendment to the U.S. Constitution that forced deficit to be zero. This is shilling in heaven. government abdicated their ability to control the debt. And so they're now saying, we can't do that. We cannot agree among ourselves. So let's have a constitutional amendment that forces us to have deficits being equal to zero. And so they're just move the problem to the Constitution. And to the extent that the Constitution of the United States is sacred, then we're going to be behaving. A milder version of this, shelling in action, took place during the last shutdown. It's called sequestering. Sequestering is, we're gonna cut down government purchases, and we're not gonna go agency by agency. So all the agencies cut by a given proportion. Right? So that avoids any issue of choice. As you can see, right, that I am just not particularly impressed with the treatment of fiscal policy. I'm very impressed with public finance, but not with the view that fiscal policy is just a substitute for monetary policy. Now, I'm biased, okay? All right. Jesus Christ, okay, so let me, I'm bitching about it and I'm hoping the next one is over. No, there's another one. So let me show you the kind of things that I do like. How do I assess the sustainability of government debt? Well, I start with the very definition of the budget deficit. So here it is: revenue minus purchases minus interest on the debt. When we talk about cyclically adjusted budget, what we're doing is replacing this Y with potential output. That's all we're doing. Okay. Okay, so this is the definition. Then the change in debt is the budget deficit. Notice that I'm putting a negative sign in front of the budget to call it deficit. And so now we have in here, here's the definition of the budget. I change the sign, and I start rearranging terms. What I'm doing is separating the role of what's called discretionary purchases from compulsive mandatory expenditures. The United States cannot choose not to pay interest on the debt. The United States can choose not to have another F-16. And so we separate those two things. We say there are things over which you have discretion, there are things over which you do not. Interest on the government debt is one of them. Grace, were you okay with this? Okay. And so now, the next step involves manipulation of this expression. The first thing to do is to compute the debt to GNP ratio. So it's debt over output. The next thing we do is to compute the growth rate of that ratio. And it's going to be the growth rate of debt minus the growth rate of income. Now I'll take the numerator in this expression and open it up, and I now have the discretionary budget minus plus interest payments over debt minus the growth rate of income. And I keep parsing this out until I get to this expression right here. What I want is for you to, for a moment, to abstract from this term. I will bring it up in just a second. You can see that if the interest rate is greater than your income growth, then the debt burden is going to increase over time. That's why when you try to get a loan, one of the very first questions they're going to ask you is, tell me your salary history or your employment history. Not like I'm working here and I'm working there, you're working here and there, and how much did you make? Because what they're doing is computing this growth rate. So if the interest rate on the loan exceeds your, let me call it your growth potential for salary, they're not going to extend that loan. So think of this difference, the difference between the interest rate and the growth rate of nominal income as the capacity to serve the debt. So if the capacity to serve the debt is higher than the income, than the interest rate, then the debt burden declines. And here's the one that I want to call your attention. I want you to imagine for a moment that the nominal interest rate is the same as the growth rate of nominal income, And if for some reason, mostly for pedagogical ones, this F equals to 0. So do we conclude from that there's not going to be any increase in debt? The answer to that is no. Why? Because we still have a debt and we still have to pay interest on that debt. So interest rate equals growth rate of income. The discretionary budget is 0. Our debt continues to grow. Not because we're spendthrift, not because we're living beyond our means, not because there is a war, but because we have a debt, and that debt needs to be, the interest on that debt has to be paid. Okay? One way of looking at that is, okay, so delta D is going to be just the interest rate times the debt. You get the expression for the growth rate of the debt burden, the growth rate of debt minus the growth rate of income. This delta D is just that term minus that term, so they're assumed equal, so therefore it's 0. Question that I have is this one of those assumptions that people make for which there is no basis, but it yields a neat equation? Is it the case that, is it reasonable to assume that the growth rate of nominal income is about the interest rate? Sure. When I wrote that down, were you thinking, what the hell is this guy doing? Why don't he put the interest rate equals the growth rate of income exponentiated to 10?
I mean, it's just an assumption, right?
Well, yeah, it's an assumption, but because it's an assumption, you're gonna assume anything I want. And so the issue that is at stake is there any reason to even believe that this assumption corresponds to the data? You want me to ask Tanya? She feels left out.
I'm just not really
Where's
sure.
Tanya? Tanya, does it make sense to you?
I'm actually a little bit lost in that feeling.
Jeff? Okay, Ariel?
I kind of took it as all the other assumptions that we look at, like, omega equals 0, sigma equals
Right.
0. So it's just another exercise of just trying to figure it out.
Right, okay, good. So, back to the question.
I mean, I guess if you're looking at if it's the growth rate, then it could make sense if you're trying to match it so the interest rate equals your growth rate. Try to see how the economy does when they kind of go together.
Well, you are attaching some personalities to these terms, which is fine, but I want to take a slightly different peek. What is the growth rate of the United States now? Approximately.
1 to 2%.
Good. What is the inflation rate of the United States?
1 to 2%.
So let's call that the growth rate of real plus inflation rate equals the growth rate of nominal. So it's about 4%. What is the current interest rate that you could get? I know it depends on how long the term is, but if somebody tells you an interest rate of 4%, would you find that particularly, oh no, what are you doing? This is completely crazy.
It's maybe a little high.
Which one is high? The interest
4%
rate?
interest rate.
That's what the 30-year treasuries are yielding now.
Okay.
3.5. And so you can see how the nominal interest rate on average tends to be equal to the growth rate of nominal income. Okay? But it's slightly different. What is the nominal interest rate equal to? It's the real interest rate plus the expected inflation. It's the Fisher equation talking back to us. Okay, so real interest rate plus expected inflation equals growth rate of real GDP plus actual inflation. So if we say that on average expectations are about rational, then those two terms cancel out. And so I now have that the real interest rate is about the growth rate of real GDP. Is that a weird thing? No. And so this assumption It is an assumption, just as omega is zero, an assumption, but nevertheless, it's one of those assumptions for which there is an empirical counterpart that we can use. Okay,
Sorry. So what is the what is the reality here? So which assumption holds true?
I'm saying that this tends on average to be correct. Not every day, not every quarter, but if you were to compute the difference between the nominal interest rate and the growth rate of nominal income, the difference will average out to zero over a long horizon. Now, you can say, well, that depends on the interest rate that I pick, right? And so, yes, it depends on the interest rate that I pick.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if this applies to other countries other than U.S. or developed countries, because if a country is not doing well, say in emerging market, generally their interest rate, which they pay to their external debt, will increase, and because they're not doing well, and because they are paying a higher interest, their economy will suffer more. So that's where the direction can kind of diverge, and the problem just exacerbates itself.
Yeah, but what I'm trying is to get, so if the country's not doing well, but if at one point it has to do well, right? Because the not doing well has to be in reference to something.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so if it's not doing well now, the presumption in the United States is not doing well now by many observers. And so well, what do we mean it's not doing well? How do we know that this is not it? Well, because we have been well before. So if you look at that gap over years, the claim that I'm making is that on average, the nominal interest rate is going to be equal to the growth rate of nominal GDP. What it does assume, or what it does need, and this is part of specific to the United States, is some financial markets that don't have that many regulations, so that you can charge the interest rate that you want. So if you have a country in which that has caps on interest rates, well then that's going to be that's going to get in the way of this. Okay. All right. How do we know when a debt is sustainable? We say that a debt is sustainable if the debt burden does not grow. In other words, if the growth rate of the debt burden is not positive. This is a fairly, I want to say fairly conventional view. Ideally, we would like to have a debt to GDP ratio that once debt goes above it, then there's an adjustment. But we don't know what that is. And so as a result of that, there's going to be, we're replacing ignorance with an assumption. So we're saying, so long as the debt burden is declining, the debt is deemed sustainable. That means that our capacity to service the debt has to be growing faster than the debt itself. You could be borrowing, What matters is that your capacity to serve those loans grows faster than the loans themselves. And what I want you to imagine now is that rather than dealing with inequality, we're going to be dealing with equality. And I say, I'm going to declare that the debt is sustainable if the debt burden is not growing at all. So it is zero. So that means that the growth rate of nominal debt will be equal to the growth rate of income. Okay. The issue is, so what do I do with this? So that's where we get. I want to denote as this star the value of the debt burden such that it doesn't grow anymore. This marker is making the area of transparency look great. Lexi, is there? Oh, there's one here.
There's one up on here too.
Thank you so much. So long as this little D is rising, the debt is being unsustainable. What we're doing here is saying that it eventually reaches a level. We don't know what that level is. But what we're claiming is that even though we don't know it, we know that it exists. So we don't know whether it's 100% or 120%, but we know that it exists. And we call that the star. That's what I'm doing there. So if you tell me what's the critical debt ratio to GDP, the answer is I don't know. I do know that it exists. And what we're doing here is assume that the debt burden is not growing over time, and that implies that D is constant. And I'm calling that constant D star. And then I'm going to change, then I make assumptions about this. Okay? So that's what that is doing. Now, once I do that, then I go in, remember, this equation here is the condition that says the growth rate in income has to be equal to the growth rate in debt. This terming here is what I'm calling D star. Notice that there is no time subscript for that anymore. Okay? So the change in debt to be sustainable has to be equal the change in income times the D star. Now I go and see, but I don't know what the debt is. I know what the budget deficit is. So I now come in here and replace the delta D with the budget deficit. I now have in here I divide this is the budget deficit equals D stars times delta Y, and I divide both sides by the level of output. What do I get out of that? Well, we start fiscal policy by saying, is the debt sustainable? Answer, I don't know. Then it says, what are the conditions for sustainability? Then we said, we define the debt burden, and we say, for it to be sustainable, the debt burden cannot be growing. Because if it is growing, then it will not be sustainable. And eventually, the debt service will chew up all of my income. That's what happened in the housing market in the United States. And so we impose from the outside this requirement that in order for the debt to be sustainable, the debt burden has to be constant. We don't know what that constant is, but we are asserting that it exists, and we call it D star. That's what this is. Then okay, so he said, so you will be saying, you're telling me that you dream up this crap about the budget being sustainable if something that cannot be observed is constant. That sounds weird, right? That's just not the way to go. And then this set of transformations in here is what makes the calculations observable. This deficit to GDP ratio here is not just any deficit to GDP ratio. That's the deficit to GDP ratio that is consistent with debt sustainability. If we knew D star. So if I tell you that the D star is 100%, then I multiply 100% times the growth rate of income, and that is the upper bound on the budget deficit. Anything above it is not sustainable. All right? So then I say, well, let's take a look to data. I picked countries in here from what I think representative of what we have in the class. So we have Sharjah right there. Then we have Grace right there. Then we have Koshu. I forgot the name. you tell me? I thought you were from Korea. Just kidding. We have Mauricio and we have Pete. Pete, you're from the United States,
Yes. I was born in the United States.
but raised in the moon or where?
I was raised mostly outside the United States.
Okay, so this is me. Just rather than get into trouble. So check this, right? This has two parts. Part one is history, part two is what the IMF forecasts this debt to GDP ratios be. Take a look to China. Notice that according to the IMF, the debt to GDP ratio is declining in China. So this is clearly, from the standpoint of this definition, sustainable. Check the United States. It rose substantially during the fiscal crisis, but the IMF is forecasting that the debt burden itself is not going to rise over time. Japan rose considerably, but even for Japan, what the IMF is saying is that all of these external debts are sustainable going forward, because none of them have debt to GDP ratios increasing. If we were doing this maybe a couple of years ago, and you will have, say, in the case of the United States and here, so imagine that we were doing this, say, a couple of years ago, and we'll have a debt to GDP ratio of the United States increasing, and also for Japan, and while I'm at it, also for China. So there will be a concern about, is that debt sustainable? The IMF settles this. No, it's not. There is no debt problem, at least for this country. And so it was so what? And so that's what I want to know is the budget deficit. And so this is what I did. The red line is the actual budget deficit in the United States as a percent of GDP. All this data comes from the World Economic Outlook. And so in order to get, well, what would be sustainable? What would have been the sustainable budget deficit of the United States? I assumed that this star was equal to 100. So that's a debt to GDP ratio of 100. And I assume a nominal GDP growth rate of 5%. I multiply the two idiots next to each other, and here's the blue line. That's it. And so so I'm thinking now, well, what about that Taylor rule, right? That Taylor rule tells me when monetary policy is overly expansionary or not. So I'm looking at this and say, well, the US fiscal policy was clearly expansionary over that period, but then, again, based on IMF data, it seems to be returning to something that is sustainable. So this will then give some comfort to observers of the United States. Okay, this is it for me. Do you have questions?
So if it's some constant where the change in debt over the amount of debt is equal to zero, and that's at some constant, if we look at the last chart, I mean, sustainability is gonna depend on interest rate payments, right?
Yeah.
But why doesn't the United States just go to 250% and it can be sustainable like Japan can at 250% overnight?
Oh,
And
I'm
what
sorry,
is it?
just to be sure that I'm understanding this. You're saying, why couldn't the Americans say, hey, our situation is not that bad, look at Japan,
Yeah, and then,
right? And so let's be like them.
yeah.
That's,
Somebody says, well, why don't we be like China instead? Their situation is much better, right? They have a lower budget deficit, a lower debt. The issue is this, and this is now where you're now going to get out of me my particular annoyances to fiscal policy, and that is it depends on policymakers' views of the role of government in the economy. Okay? Some policymakers in the United States, fiscal policymakers, argue that there shouldn't be a role of the government in the economy. That the role of the government should be limited to the administration of justice, national defense, airports, ports, highways, stuff. Not much more than that. Oh, well, yeah, defense is a big deal. The idea that the government is going to help some people with disadvantage or deal with this or deal with that is just not on the radar screen. They believe this as a matter of faith. Okay? And so, to answer your question, why, you say, why couldn't the United States say, hey, we got room to grow, right? I'm simplifying what you said, but, and this will be not particularly well taken by many members of the US Congress because it will contradict their faith-based views of the role of government in the economy. I don't know, I don't subscribe to those views, but I don't have a really powerful argument against them either. So I'm just a proponent of a different faith. But I don't have, so that's my sense why the US government does not follow that track. Okay. What's that? Stop it.
Yeah, so, I mean, comparing like developed markets with emerging markets, why is that some countries like Japan can raise up to like 250% of their GDP and still have no problem with their interest that the governments pay, you know, to the private sector when they issue their debt. But for some other countries like Indonesia or India, even when they have a lower debt to GDP ratio, they still have to pay so much in terms of their interest.
Yeah, the issue here is, do you believe, or I don't mean you particular, but the belief is that the government of Japan is not going to default. That the government of Japan is not like the government of Argentina, that they are good on their debt. And what that means is that, so that's one consideration. The other consideration is that Japan has very large internal financial markets. And so this government debt could be entirely financed by domestic suppliers of credit. When an emerging market does not have the depth of financial markets that Japan has, then it has to rely on external funding. And external funding then raises complications that on two fronts, say Argentina. First, in what currency will the debt be denominated, or the loan be denominated? Will it be in local currency or in US dollars? Most of the time is in a currency that it is not of the country of origin. So it will be in US dollars. The second thing that is gonna come in is to what extent the country has a tradition of civil law, of property rights, on the belief that the government cannot just say, sorry, we're not gonna pay you. Japan has that tradition. It's a tradition of adherence to the law. Okay? And so when you have these two considerations put together, then what comes across is that the debt to GNP ratio of Japan could be considerably higher than the one in Bangladesh, because in the eyes of international lenders, Japan is not as risky as Bangladesh. Now, I'm making up the, Sharjeel is just probably gonna kill me in a minute. Right?
No, I mean, this is pretty much, all of this is included in a credit rating, right, of a particular country. That's how, I mean, the inherent risk in lending to a particular country, I think, and the interest rate that is basically determined when you lend further.
Yeah.
That's all part of the credit rating, and I think we're at BB minus or something like that.
Yeah.
We have to pay much higher than Japan. I mean, we're like, Japan is,
Triple A.
double A, triple A or something like that, right? In the rating.
And so it is unfortunately a matter of perceptions. These perceptions have, if you want, grounding. The grounding is what is the system of law? Who holds this debt? If it is mostly local residents, then they're gonna pay for it. Either because, one second, because either by recurrent equivalence or some other measure. Question.
So does the level of D star essentially depend on how developed the internal financial markets are? And if so, can that change over time?
Yes, yes to both. Which is another way of saying, we don't know what D star is. And so we need to keep an eye, always, we need to make an assumption. That's why I did, so for example, I don't know whether a D star of 100% for the United States would have been thought, say, 20 years ago as way too big. Like ridiculously high. Now, this is what it is now. It's 100%, and so I'm just, and so what, if I were doing this, I would be probably putting more lines in there, keeping the growth rate of income at 5%, and doing D-star of 120, 140, so this will be accompanied by a collection of lines, right? Not just my magical D-star, so there will be several of them. And so this will not answer the question, well, what is D-star? It says, I don't know what it is, but I can get a sense of what it needs to be because the debt is being financed, so I know that it is, from that standpoint, already deemed sustainable. Okay? So yes, it does depend on but I'm not saying anything new, right? My ability to borrow depends on for how long I have been working, do I have a credit history, do I have so it matters. My personal D-star varies over time. Jason.
Yeah, I just want to add on to Jonathan's point a little bit. I think there are some other considerations like net asset position. So this is just debt. So if you have sufficient assets to back your debt, then you're fine. And also, like, what's the debt being used for? Because I think in some countries there are statutory mandates that limit the debt, how it's being used. If it's used only for investment purposes, then the risk ratings for the country is also different.
Peter.
If there's this issue of assets, how come after the financial crisis and debt default, the IMF makes countries sell their assets? Like, if so, debt sustainability is based off of what assets the government or the country holds, like its ports or its airports. Why would, in like a stabilization plan, would a country be forced to privatize its ports in order to pay down its debt that it defaulted on?
Well, there are two alternatives that I can see. One, don't do it, or do more government intervention. My sense of what, the answer is I don't know what the IMF does. Okay, but I think I have a good sense of it. The idea is that the government has an external obligation. Okay, that external obligation has to be paid or serviced. Question is, where are the resources for that going to come from? And so they start selling stuff to service that. That's it. That's.
I guess, like,
You may wonder, however, if, say, a government that is into the business of making cars is the right way to go. If the government is in the business of, doing things that the private sector normally does, but the government says, no, I want to do it, you may wonder about that allocation of resources. Nevertheless, abstracting from that, they need the revenue right now. So they'll start selling. It's almost like if I go bankrupt, I'm gonna start selling my house. That is really it.
Professor, just one last question. I was just trying to put a definition on D-star, and can we go above 100%?
Yeah.
Like you said. So doesn't that sort of mean that I am using more than my income is growing to repay my debt? Does it mean something like that? Say, it's basically, I'm going back to that slide where we have minus budget deficit divided by YT is equal to D-star.
So we don't have to get that fancy, just looking here. This
Yeah.
is Japan.
So
Go ahead.
I'm just wondering, basically, D-star represents the fraction of my growth in income to repay my debt. Is that right, or?
Well, everything was going fine until you said the word fraction.
Or it can be 1 or more than whatever it
Okay.
is. So if it goes above 1 or 100%, what does that imply?
Well, that implies that if you have to repay, that you couldn't repay your debt at once using your income. But what we're trying to do is not view it that way. I mean, just look this, right? Look at Japan. Japan debt to G ratio went from, let's call it 170 to 240 in 10 years. So the concern is not so much the level and what it means. The concern is it growing or is it falling? Because if we get hung up on the value of this star, then we're going to ignore some of the questions that Koshu brought up, namely that the value of this star changes over time. And so rather than asking what is the magic of this star, we're asking, don't ask that question. That question doesn't have a verifiable answer. Ask the question, is the growth rate of D falling? And in here, it is falling most notably for China. Okay. So next time, I'm going to finish the course by, I'm gonna, what I say, close the circle of this by dealing with models of expectation that are not rational. Okay? So I will post the notes. And I will try also to offer you a summary of what we have done and how the different components fit into it. I'll ask Kelly to set up, to find a room for us for Saturday after that.
Thank you.
Thank you.